Rationalization of production. The impact of the global industrial crisis on Japan resulted in a sharp decline in the export of raw silk, the export of which was entirely dependent on the needs of the United States. At the same time, due to a sharp drop in silver prices, which was also the result of the crisis, the export of goods to China completely stopped. Thus, the plans of the monopolists, who hoped by lifting the embargo on the export of gold to stabilize prices and increase exports, were scattered. At the same time, purchasing power within the country was decreasing more and more, which led to a further deepening of the depression. In the end, depression resulted in a brutal industrial crisis. The fall in commodity prices for the period from March 1929 to September 1930 can be illustrated by the example of lower prices for the 8 most important types of goods. On average, prices for these products fell by 37%. Least of all, by 13%, paper prices fell. The largest decrease was in the price of cement by 56%, raw silk by 52% and cotton yarn by 43%. As a result, there was a decline in production. If we take the level of industrial production of these goods in October 1929 as 100, then during the period of maximum decline it amounted to 60% for raw silk, 26% for cotton yarn, and 30% for coal. In an increasingly aggravated economic crisis, monopoly capital exerted all its efforts to shift the severity of the crisis onto the shoulders of workers and 140 thus eliminate the threat hanging over the monopolists. So, for example, the Kanagafuji Spinning and Weaving Company reduced the wages of its workers by 30% in 1930, thereby ensuring high dividends to its shareholders due to this. This was possible because monopoly capital, by reducing wages and increasing labor intensification, sought to shift the main burden of the crisis onto the shoulders of workers. At the same time, he tried in every possible way to maintain monopoly prices by systematically curtailing production. For its part, the state also supported monopoly capital by pursuing a policy of rationalization of production. Even during the lifting of the embargo on the export of gold, monopoly capital showed particular concern that the leakage of gold would cause a sharp drop in commodity prices, which, on the one hand, would lead to a temporary economic depression within Japan itself, and on the other hand, would aggravate the competition with foreign states. All this will cause a narrowing of both the domestic and foreign markets, which will result in an even greater gap between the possibilities of production and marketing of goods. Therefore, the monopolists considered it necessary to simultaneously reduce production costs and limit its size. It is in this connection that in November 1929 the Hamaguchi government established a committee to study the issue of rationalizing production, and in June 1930 created a special department for rationalizing production. The interweaving of the industrial crisis with the agricultural crisis caused a further deepening of the general economic crisis. Agricultural prices, already declining as a result of the crisis, have fallen further as a result of depression in the United States. First of all, 141, the price of cocoons fell. The price of raw silk, which amounted to 1,100 yen in May 1930, fell by 36.8% in less than a month, or to 795 yen. Cocoon prices fell in the midst of cocoon harvesting and were even more catastrophic than raw silk prices. So, in September 1930, compared with September 1929, the price of cocoons fell by 65%. This meant that the main damage from the fall in prices for raw clicks was suffered by silkworm peasants, whose situation in this connection worsened even more. It should be noted that they accounted for 40% of all Japanese peasants. In a sericulture area such as Nagano Prefecture, peasants had absolutely no cash. It came to the point that when paying for services for a funeral, they paid with scraps of paper on which 5 or 10 sen was written, and only later, under these conditions, in October 1930, data on the expected rice harvest were published, and it was supposed to collect a record amount of grain. This led to a sharp drop in rice prices and caused the so-called hunger in the harvest year. If in January 1931 coke of rice cost 27 yen, then by January 1931 its price dropped to 16 yen, which led to the complete collapse of the peasant farms. At the same time, 1931 was a lean year for the Tohoku region in Hokkaido Island. In these areas, the situation was so dire that the peasants, driven by hunger, even before the onset of snowfall went to the mountains and fields, where they dug up the roots of ferns, mixed with potatoes and brown rice, ate this mess, hardly supporting their lives. Suffer from hunger in both productive and lean years, such was the lot of Japanese peasants. In industry, as a result of curtailing production, monopoly prices continued to remain at a relatively high level. In this regard, the gap between the prices of manufactured goods and greatly reduced prices for agricultural products has become even greater. This also led to further 142, the impoverishment of the peasants. Moreover, as a result of the depression in industry, income from byproducts fell sharply, accounting for about 20% of the income of peasant farms. In connection with curtailing production, lowering wages and laying offs, such a serious source of collateral incomes of peasant farms as the earnings of weavers, seamstresses, and silkworm workers was threatened. In addition, the peasants had to take on their shoulders a huge army of the unemployed, who, having no livelihood in the city, returned to their relatives in the village. Thus, the industrial crisis, exacerbated by the aggravation of the crisis in agriculture, further accelerated the impoverishment of the peasantry. So the capitalists passed on to the shoulders of the workers and peasants the whole burden of the economic crisis. At the same time, large capitalists, seeking to overcome the crisis, scaled down production on a large scale and carried out cartelization of industry. In the midst of the crisis, cartels were created in about 50 industries. A particularly large number of cartels appeared in various sectors of the heavy industry. Through cartels, production was reduced, industrial capacities were distributed, agreements were concluded regarding prices and sales of products, and the volume of production was established at enterprises. The cartelling that was being carried out at that time, the aim of which was to establish control over industrial production and sales of products, was facilitated by the policy of rationalization of industry implemented by the Hamaguchi government. This policy found expression in legislation aimed at strengthening control over production. In the field of heavy industry, the law on control in the most important industries was in force. In relation to medium and small enterprises, the law on industrial associations. In the field of export, the law on export associations. etc. The most important of these laws was the law on control in the most important branches of production. 143. The purpose of all these laws was to establish strict control over production through the use of state power in the interests of monopoly capital. Thanks to this, the cartels took a dominant position in almost all sectors of Japanese industry. At the time when cartels of various industries were being cartelized, the monopolistic capital of Zaibatsu Mitsui, Mitsubishi, Sumitomo and others dominated the cartels, thus subjugating the entire Japanese economy. So, in the coal industry, the Seikoton Kogori no Kokai cartel was created. He independently exercised control over the entire coal industry of the country. At the same time, 31% of coal production was controlled by Mitsui, 18% by Mitsubishi, 5% by Sumitomo, and together with other, smaller monopolistic associations, Zaibatsu controlled 83% of coal production in Japan. This situation, with slight deviations, was observed in other industries. But despite the unification of monopoly capital in cartels, it should be emphasized that the cartel industry was carried out under the leadership of major banks. This led to an increase in the dominance of banking capital in industry, to the fact that the tycoons of the financial oligarchy Zaibatsu secured a dominant position in the entire Japanese economy. For example, an agreement on the supply of electricity, reached in 1931 between large companies such as Daido Denryaku, Nihon Denryaku, Tokyo Dento and others, was implemented at the direction of the head of the Mitsui concern, Ikeda Seihin. Mitsui Bank Mitsui Ginko, having intervened in the affairs of the Tokyo Dento Company, completely took it in hand. Thus, the plans of the Hamaguchi cabinet, aimed at creating by lifting the embargo on the export of gold conditions 144 for economic recovery for many years, plunged the workers and peasants into poverty. At the same time, monopoly capital and especially large Zaibatsu, taking advantage of state power, obtained from the government a policy of rationalizing production which enabled them to get maximum profits even in the conditions of the economic crisis. The crisis has led large Zaibatsu to subjugate state power. London Arms Reduction Conference Saidahara Kojiro served as Minister of Foreign Affairs from 1924 to 1931. His foreign policy course of international cooperation, which was based on the so-called Four Principles of Policy towards China, was the basis on which Japan's foreign policy was developing at that time. These principles included 1. Non-interference in the civil war in China. 2. Coexistence and shared prosperity based on economic agreements. 3. Tolerance and sympathy for the current situation in China. 4. Rational protection of national interests. However, a change in the international and domestic situation has made it difficult to follow the letter of this broadcasting policy. The Saidahara diplomacy, which was carried out by the Hamaguchi government, which replaced the Tanaka government, could not fail to discover its aggressive essence. In any case, it has lost its ability to restrain the activities of the militarists aimed at starting a war. The last act of Saidahara's diplomacy, the rock that she stumbled upon, collapsed, was the London Arms Reduction Conference. Generally speaking, conferences on arms reduction, on the one hand, reflected the demand of the peoples to ensure peace, since it was the people who bore the entire 145 burden of wars. In addition, they were called forth by necessity, especially experienced by the governments of great powers by saving military finances. But, on the other hand, by convening such conferences, the great powers tried to mutually restrain each other and seize the dominant position in the world. At the Washington Conference of 1921 to 1922, an agreement was reached between the five great naval powers on the total tonnage of battleships. After this conference, competition began in the field of construction of auxiliary vessels. In 1927, the Second Conference on the Reduction of Naval Armaments opened in Geneva, but in connection with the clash of points of view of England and the United States, it was not possible to come to any agreement on it. In January 1930, an agreement was reached between the newly elected United States President Hoover and the Prime Minister of the newly created English Labour government MacDonald, which resulted in the London Conference on the Reduction of Naval Arms. The plenipotentiary representatives of Japan at the conference were appointed leader of the Minsaido Party, former Prime Minister Wakatsubi Reihiro, Naval Minister Sabe Takeshi, Japanese Ambassador to England Matsuhara Tsuneo and Japanese Ambassador to Belgium Nagayi Matsuzo. Japanese maritime circles insisted on giving Japan the right to have so many heavy cruisers and auxiliary vessels, the tonnage of which would be 70% of the tonnage of vessels of the same types in the United States. In addition, they demanded that the tonnage of the Japanese submarine fleet be set at 78,000 tons. However, the Japanese government, silencing that it intends to assert Japan's right to have a fleet equal in tonnage to 70% of the U.S. fleet, proposed that such a reduction of the fleet that would eliminate the threat, that is, the fleets in their strength be insufficient for attacks but enough for defense. In this way, the Japanese government tried to implement 146 Principle of International Cooperation, but the reduction that would eliminate the threat proclaimed by the Japanese government was not peaceful. The fact is that Japan pursued the goal of preserving its military superiority over England and the United States in the Far East and ensuring that it was not impeded in moving to China and the countries of the South Seas. However, in the implementation of these plans, she faced a huge lack of finance. In particular, the share of military spending in its annual budget was almost 2 times higher than the same item in the English and American budgets. Therefore, the position taken by Japan at the conference gave her the only real way to avoid rivalry with England and the United States in the field of construction of warships. But putting forward, allegedly in the interests of defense, the requirement to grant Japan the right to have a fleet, we will achieve 70%, but our partners also have certain requirements and self-esteem. Therefore, they will not blindly follow the insistence of Japan. Since all disputed issues were resolved at the conference between England and the United States, the main controversy over the question of the tonnage of the fleets broke out between Japan and the United States. After the relevant negotiations, which were repeatedly threatened with disruption, a preliminary agreement was reached, according to which Japan was allowed to have 60% heavy cruisers, 70% light cruisers and destroyers and the same number of submarines with a total displacement of 52,700 tons in the USA. When Japanese plenipotentiaries announced this agreement in Tokyo, naval circles sharply opposed the project. But the cabinet unanimously approved it, which was announced on April 1 to the Japanese representatives in London. However, the next day, the chief of the main naval staff of Kato 147, Kanji, presented the emperor with a report in which he expressed his disagreement with the decision of the cabinet. At the same time, he issued a statement that in the case of the implementation of this agreement, ensuring national defense would be even more difficult. The government's actions, expressed in sending instructions to Japanese representatives at the conference without the consent of the main naval headquarters, were sharply criticized by the maritime circles, who saw this as a violation of the rights of the Supreme Commander, since the decision on the number of armed forces was the prerogative of the latter. So the question arose of the rights of the Supreme Commander. According to the Meiji Constitution, the Emperor exercises the highest command of the land, army and navy, Article 11, and determines the organization and size of the regular composition of the land, army and navy, Article 12. These constitutional provisions reflected the demand of an absolutist government seeking to avoid parliamentary interference in military affairs. In interpreting Article 11 of the Constitution, the principle of independence of the Supreme Command was widely recognized. So, tactical control of the land and naval forces was carried out under the leadership of the Emperor by the high command bodies, the General Staff and the main naval headquarters, and in wartime by the Imperial headquarters. Even the ministers did not take any part in this. As for Article 12 of the Constitution, since the organization and size of the regular composition of the land, army and navy, on the one hand, were closely related to the tactical side of the military leadership, and on the other, they had a huge impact on politics, diplomacy, and finance, the question arose whether the emperor, in accordance with his right to general leadership of the armed forces, should resolve these issues independently or not. The issue of the quantity of armaments raised by the London Agreement specifically concerned Article 12 of the Meiji Constitution. Professor Minobu Tatsukichi, who advanced the doctrine, according to 148, which sovereignty belongs to the state, and the emperor is the supreme organ of the state. Minobu was subjected to constant harassment for this doctrine, supported the position of the government, emphasizing that the point of view of the main naval headquarters cannot play a decisive role in the matter of concluding an agreement on arms reduction. Just at that time, the 58th session of Parliament opened. The Hamaguchi government held the following point of view: since the London Agreement deals with the issue of the number of naval weapons, and its decision is the responsibility of the government, sending instructions to the Japanese representatives, despite some objections from the main naval headquarters, does not violate the emperor's right to exercise high command. However, the government was afraid that if it stated that, according to Article 12 of the Constitution, which determines the right of the high command in the field of organization of the armed forces, this right is within the competence of ministers and high command, such a statement will cause unanimous protest from the Army and Navy. Thus, in this matter, the government has taken an ambiguous position. During the debate, an officer of the main naval headquarters, Captain 3rd Rank Kusakari, sent as an expert to the London Conference, committed suicide, leaving the following letter: "May death be my repentance to the people for the London Agreement." In this regard, the young officers of the Army and Navy, as well as right-wing organizations, raised a cry: "Do not forget about the death of Captain Kusakari, who died due to the Liberals." The attacks on compromising, weak diplomacy intensified. In this situation, The London Agreement on the Reduction of Naval Arms was signed on April 22. On July 4, it was referred to the Privy Council. Within 3 months between the government and the Secret 149, the Council had a first discussion on the prerogatives of the High Military Command and on the state of state defense. Some members of the Privy Council considered it necessary to reject the agreement, but the government resolutely came out in defense of it, and on October 1 it was ratified. Nevertheless, attacks on the government by the military and right-wing organizations have not decreased. On the morning of November 14, a reactionary-minded young man fired a pistol and seriously wounded Prime Minister Hamaguchi, who was going to go to the Kansai area and was at that moment on the platform of Tokyo Station. The assassin, Seigo Yedao, turned out to be a member of the Patriot Aikokusha organization led by Iwata Inosuke. The question of the prerogatives of the High Military Command that arose in connection with the London Agreement was used to unite the right with the military. During this period, all kinds of ultranationalist movements entered the political arena. The anxiety that engulfed society in connection with the economic crisis also played a role in the development of these movements. However, the government did not intend to take any measures to overcome the crisis, confining itself to a statement in Parliament that depression throughout the world is the cause of depression in Japan. Using this position of the cabinet, the right-wing groups called for the overthrow of the government and Zaibatsu. Nevertheless, the government, with a somewhat unusual persistence in such conditions, carried out arms reduction. This was because in the elections, held in February 1930, just during the London Conference, the government party received an overwhelming majority of votes and was confident in its abilities. In addition, the support given to the Zaibatsu government, as well as the government's policy to streamline production, also played a role. Finally, government action was directly encouraged by the genre Prince Saionji. One cannot also discount the fact that the government to one degree or another finally, government action was directly encouraged by the genre Prince Saionji. One cannot also discount the fact that the government to one degree or another finally, government action was directly encouraged by the genre Prince Saionji. One cannot also discount the fact that the government to one degree or another 150 enjoyed the support of public opinion, which was heavily influenced by the ideas of liberalism and hoped to maintain peace through arms reduction. Saidahara diplomacy. In such circumstances, the London Agreement was ratified. But in drawing up the budget for the next year, 1931, the government was forced to agree to the armament replacement program presented by the Fleet Command. To implement this program, up to 394 million yen was required with an appropriation of 95.4 million yen at the beginning of the year. The agreement of the government was caused by the need to mitigate the discontent of the naval circles in connection with the conclusion of the London Agreement. The fact is that the Hamaguchi government, which promised during the London Conference to reject the demands of the most extremist groups from the naval circles, could not dare to take such a risk as rejecting the weapons replacement program, since in doing so it would restore even the supporters of compromise against itself and would lose all popularity in naval circles. All this could shake the very foundations of the cabinet. Party offices in Japan, even during their heyday, always faced a similar threat. but it should be borne in mind that in essence the diplomacy of cooperation proclaimed by Saidahara did not in any way contradict the course towards war. Even after the formation of the Hamaguchi cabinet, the share of direct military expenditures in the state budget did not essentially change. In 1929, it was announced that the total budget for 1929, in accordance with the savings regime, would be reduced by 6.89%. But in reality, the budget of the military and naval ministries was reduced by only 4.39%. Thus, compared to that period, 151, when the reactionary government of the military, headed by Tanaka, was in power, the share of military spending in the budget not only did not decrease, but even increased slightly. True, in the budget of 1930 the amount of appropriations for the military and naval ministries decreased compared to the previous year, but its share in relation to the entire budget increased to 28.5%. Moreover, during this period, the share of strategic goods in total Japanese imports increased significantly. In 1927, while the Tanaka government was in power, strategic goods accounted for 35%, and in 1928, 39% of all imports, while in 1929 to 1930, when the Hamaguchi cabinet came to power, this percentage increased to 41. A comparison of military spending in the budget of Japan with military spending in the budget of other countries gives the following picture. In England they amounted to 14% of the budget, in the USA 21, in France 22, in Italy 24, and in Japan 29%. Thus, Japan occupied the first place in the world in the share of military expenditures in the total budget, far ahead of England in this respect. All these facts indicate that, despite the principle of cooperation and peace policy which were declared by the diplomacy of Hamaguchi Saidahara, preparations for the war were unremitting pace, and only fearing the aggravation of contradictions with the great powers, the Japanese government avoided pursuing an openly adventurous policy. It set itself the goal of strengthening the monopoly capital by means of the economy regime and rationalizing production, using it to develop military production and complete the creation of a system that would quickly mobilize industry. For example, the Resource Department, which was established by the Tanaka government and was directly subordinate to the cabinet, which was the main headquarters that carried out industrial preparations for the war. 152. The office issued a special magazine, Shiiji no Tozunyo to Shigenkyoku, Control and Use of Resources and the Role of Resource Management. In 1930, in the May issue of this magazine, the following was said about the goals of organizing this department. The last war was a war of huge armed forces that fought for a long time, a war of arms, a war of strategic materials. We have seen from our own experience how important it is to make our post-war economy dependent on preparations for the country's defense in peacetime. The point of view, according to which the armed forces were given primary importance during the creation of state defense, has undergone a significant change. Now it has become quite clear that the defense of the state is not a monopoly of the army, but is truly a great cause for the whole state. That war will not be a struggle between the armed forces, but a struggle between the state power of the belligerents. In this case, the idea of war is clearly carried out using all the forces of the state, the idea of universal mobilization, and that is why the task of controlling the use of resources is put forward. plans to mobilize industry began to be developed in detail. Accounting was established. It came to the point that, in case of need, even cars and wagons located in the most remote corners of the country were included in the mobilization plan. On December 1, 1929, the law on accounting for resources and related orders and instructions came into force throughout Japan. In 1929, in preparation for the general mobilization of the nation, exercises were held in Kyoto, Osaka, and Kobe to ensure the smooth operation of industry, supplying it with materials and vehicles. The rationalization policy envisaged the expansion of the heavy and chemical industry, which was directly related to the production of military materials. This policy was of military importance, because it set itself the task of adapting the economic structure to the requirements of modern warfare. Despite 153 crisis, the chemical industry continued to develop, which switched to the production of dynamite and toxic agents, the industry for the production of artificial fertilizers and paints. 99% of the large and medium-sized factories of these industries within 24 hours after the outbreak of the war could be turned into enterprises producing military materials. The purely military industry also received great development. Just before the aggression in Manchuria, in September 1931, Mitsubishi aircraft factories were the first in the country to launch the production of heavy bombers. At the same time, production of tanks, armored vehicles, anti-aircraft artillery, and other modern weapons was launched in Japan. Reservists, members of youth organizations, youth of draft age, were involved in large-scale maneuvers of the ground army, fire brigades, etc. In Kyoto, Osaka, Kobe, in the Tokyo-Yokohama area, as well as in the areas of the seaports of Yokosuka, Kure, Sasebo and others, airborne training alarms and blackout exercises began. All this happened under the Hamaguchi government. Wave of strikes. As soon as the Hamaguchi government began implementing austerity policies, it immediately published a draft law on a 10% reduction in wages for civil servants. However, all employees led by officials of the Ministry of Justice opposed this law. As a result, the government was forced to withdraw the bill. This was an unprecedented event, reflecting the aggravated internal contradictions. The most loyal public servants to the emperor, including officials of the Ministry of Justice, among whom the spirit of bureaucracy was especially strong, opposed government law. But the main force that broke the policy of the economy and rationalization of production, aimed 154 to shift the burden of the economic crisis onto the shoulders of the working people, was, of course, the struggle of workers and peasants. The data provided by the Institute for the Study of Working Conditions in Industry show that in 1930 the number of unemployed and semi-unemployed reached 3 million people. The poverty of the working masses led to a sharp increase in the number of labor conflicts and the number of participants in them from 1929 to 1930. At the same time, rental conflicts became more frequent. Small and medium-sized entrepreneurs, the petty urban bourgeoisie, over whom the threat of ruin hung over, began to fight for improving living conditions. Across the country, there was an increase in movement to reduce electricity and gas fees. Tenants, consumer companies, etc. in cities and villages, factories and on the streets, a wave of indignation and protest was bubbling everywhere. 1930 began with a workers' struggle that broke out the previous year. Tokyo Denki workers went on strike in the Kanto area, and workers at the Osaka General Motors factory went on strike in Kansai. As a result of the active work of trade union members grouping 155 around the Revolutionary Corps of the National Congress of Japanese Trade Unions, all bus drivers and workers of 7 tram routes went on strike on the 5th of December in Tokyo. However, due to the betrayal of the 4 leaders of the Tokyo Transport Workers Union, these leaders joined the National Mass Party. The workers were forced to temporarily retreat. The conflict at the General Motors plant arose in connection with the dismissal of 280 workers. A powerful demonstration of 1,300 workers took place at the plant, which resulted in a strike on December 26. Despite the new year, crowds of demonstrators surrounded the company's board building. The fight lasted until February 1. However, the actions of the leaders of the Osaka Joint Committee of the New Workers and Peasants Party, Shinro Noto, who sought to protect themselves and use the strike to strengthen their positions, led to the defeat of the workers. The Osaka events exposed the true face of the New Workers and Peasants Party and were a direct cause of the emergence of a movement for the liquidation of this party. Everywhere there was a struggle against unemployment and layoffs. 3,000 communication workers in Tokyo and Osaka presented the administration with a demand to improve the treatment of workers and stop layoffs. A strike against a lockout flared up at the Toyomo Soren Tokyo textile factory. 35,000 workers at the Kanagafuji Bosuke Cassia Spinning and Weaving Company, which has not had a single conflict since its founding and whose administration was proud of paternal care for the workers, began in April the fight against the planned 40% reduction in wages. The Joint Committee of Proletarian Parties, created to lead this struggle, proposed to proclaim April 21 as the day of struggle against the Kanagafuji Bosuke Repent Company, to convene a rally on this day and decide on it to hold a general strike at all textile enterprises. For the second time after the events of the spring of 1929, workers and employees of the Tokyo 156 Tokyo Tram Company went up to the battle, and all tram workers went on strike on April 20. Reporting this had a huge impact on transport workers throughout the country. Workers and employees of the Tokyo Ieyasu Tokyo Bus Company, the Tokyo Kogai Densha Bus Company, as well as the Kobe, Osaka and Yokohama Trams expressed solidarity with Tokyo Trams. Having put forward similar demands, they joined in the struggle. A powerful wave of strikes swept the whole country. This was a significant period in the struggle of the working people in the history of the Japanese labor movement. Capitalists and authorities responded to strikes by mass layoffs and repression. The workers courageously resisted, but as the struggle dragged on, compromisers and traitors began to appear among the union leaders. On the third day of the Tokyo Sedan tram strike, 4 leaders of the local union, these leaders betrayed the workers on strike in the spring of 1929, trying to split the labor movement, forced the 750 workers of Sabura factory under their influence to stop the strike. As a result, the next day, April 23, another 1,700 workers who were part of the former right-wing union, the Union for the Realization of the Rights of Self-Governing Organizations, stopped the strike. But 10,500 workers and employees of the company continued the strike for 2 more days, and only in the afternoon of April 25 were forced to stop it. The wave of strikes rose 3 times. At Tokyo Seiden Enterprises, where the revolutionary group enjoyed great influence, the struggle continued even after the end of the strike was announced. Workers demanded the return of fired workers and payment of wages for the period of the strike. On May 1, part of the workers left the shops. The workers continued the struggle, resorting to such means as the announcement of Safety Day, Claim Day, 157, the Day of Disobedience, etc. May 25, not paying attention to the police cordon, the workers broke through to the building of the board of the electricity company to present their demands. Police met with tear gas bombs on strike. A large number of workers were injured. The demonstration was dispersed. But, despite such repressions, the struggle continued. In the end, the culprits of the conflict, the mayor of Tokyo Harikiri and the head of Kakihai Department, were forced to retreat. The conflict that broke out in June at the Toyama Mosorin Kamita textile mill involved 2,600 women workers. The workers, led by the union, fought hard for 2 months. There was a hand-to-hand fight between members of the strikebreaker organization Justice Society of Great Japan, whose services the company used, and strikers. Similar fights ensued between strikers and police. It was a fierce fight. She received the name of street fighting. Rental conflicts. The economic crisis in the countryside was especially deep. Newspapers and magazines were full of articles about the poverty of the village. In connection with the desire of landowners to shift the severity of the economic crisis onto the shoulders of tenants, the number of rental conflicts has increased tremendously. If until 1930 an average of 2,000 rental conflicts took place in the country annually, then since 1930 the conflict curve has risen sharply. If earlier the struggle was mainly for lower rents, against higher prices, now the cause of most conflicts was the struggle for the extension of leases, in defense of the right to cultivate land, the right to lease and long-term leases, etc. The movement of peasants was growing rapidly. Trying to suppress this movement, the landowners resorted to such repressions as the prohibition of access to land, the imposition of sequestration on the land, etc. Case 158. It got to the point that state authorities were used for this. On February 28, 1931, the Supreme Court issued a ruling on cases of unfair sentences on persons convicted under criminal offenses of seizing property for entering prohibited plots and processing those plots. In response to the arbitrariness of the landlords, the peasants' tenants jointly cultivated the land and harvested together. It came to bloodshed. During the conflict in Okanoda, Yamanashi Prefecture, the landowners, led by a gang of hooligans, tried to forcibly take the land from the peasants. 18 tenants, armed with hoes and sickles, entered into a struggle with them and returned the land. The police arrested all the tenants. After that, the prefectural branch of the All Japan Peasant Union appealed to all the peasants of the prefecture to rise to defend the arrested. More than 700 peasants came to the aid of tenants, as a result of which over 200 people were arrested throughout the prefecture. However, the struggle did not stop, and in the end the peasant union won. During the conflict in Obihara, Niigata Prefecture, the poor guarded their land by resorting to force. Tenants' children also participated in this fight, who carried red flags and showered stones, attacking with a hail of stones. These were members of the Workers' and Peasants' Youth Organization. Here is what the children wrote in their school essays. However, the struggle did not stop, and in the end the Peasant Union won. During the conflict in Obihara, Niigata Prefecture, the poor guarded their land by resorting to force. Tenants' children also participated in this fight, who carried red flags and showered stones, attacking with a hail of stones. These were members of the Workers' and Peasants' Youth Organization. Here is what the children wrote in their school essays. However, the struggle did not stop, and in the end the Peasant Union won. During the conflict in Obihara, Niigata Prefecture, the poor guarded their land by resorting to force. Tenants' children also participated in this fight, who carried red flags and showered stones, attacking with a hail of stones. These were members of the Workers' and Peasants' Youth Organization. Here is what the children wrote in their school essays. "Oh, you stupid landowners! Together we sing songs about the fool landowner. As soon as she binges her, the nanny of the landowner begins to sing." Hearing this song, the landowners immediately extended their legs. 48. The essay entitled "Our Union" said, "We must unite in a union, force the scoundrels landowners to lower the tax and give us the opportunity to live. If they charge us in such a difficult year as this, we will all starve to death. Vegetables are cheap, because of the drought there are no products. After all this." 159. Do you eat rice? This is what excites us the most. That is why it is necessary to strengthen and expand our union. 49. The ruling classes threw all their forces to suppress the revolutionary movement. In this regard, the Hamaguchi government, known as liberal, was no different from the reactionary government of Toyonaka. Every year the number of those arrested and brought to trial for violating the law on maintaining public peace increased. So, in 1929, for the violation of this law, 4,924 people were arrested, of whom 339 were put on trial. In 1930 to 6,124, 307 appeared before the court. In 1932-13,938, 646 were put on trial, and in 1933-14,064 court 1,285 people. This is how the wave of the Workers' and Peasants' movement spread in those years. However, the revolutionary political forces that were supposed to lead this movement suffered serious damage in connection with the repressions of March 15 and April 16, and they could no longer act with due activity. As a result, the leadership of the new Workers' and Peasants' Party, created in 1929, not only failed to establish organizational ties with the Communist Party, but, on the contrary, showed a tendency to oppose it. This led to the fact that within the new Workers' and Peasants' Party a movement was born for the combat liquidation of the party, led by Kawakami Hajime, Uemura Susumu and others. Thus, the party was threatened with self-destruction. Organizations under the leadership of the Communist Party, including the National Council of Japanese Trade Unions, restored at the end of 1928, which followed in the footsteps of the Japan Council of Trade Unions, took an extremely left position, putting forward the slogan, "Let's turn all kinds of speeches into a general political strike." This led to the formation of the Reformist Union of Reforms, which included those who were dissatisfied with such a political line. It was shown above how, as a result of the split of the left forces, the treacherous activity of the right became possible. 160 Social Democrats, and how obstacles arose in the development of the workers' and peasants' movement. However, in the second half of 1930, the revolutionary movement began to recover. The Communist Party has again begun to strengthen and expand ties with the masses. The Communist Youth League was restored. Having reunited with the Union of Reforms Union, the National Congress of Japanese Trade Unions organized a movement to create a united front from below. He expanded his influence and strengthened his positions so much that he achieved a leading position in the Trade Union of Workers and Employees of Tokyo City Transport. A reflection of these changes in the labor movement was that among the legal proletarian parties, which had learned a lesson from the brutal defeat in the second general election in 1930, there was a tendency toward unification. In July 1931, at the initiative of the so-called Mediation Group, which included part of the members of the National Mass Party, the Workers' and Peasants' Party and the Socialist Mass Party, the National Workers' and Peasants' Mass Party was created. However, it was too late. 2 months after the organization of this party, the turbulent events in Manchuria caused the inevitable retreat of the workers' and peasants' movement. At that time, in Japan there were 300,000 organized workers, which amounted to 7% of the total number of workers. These organized workers were drawn into the whirlpool of the struggle between left, centrist and right-wing political forces, which divided the working class movement and undermined the unity of the working class. All this, naturally, led to the fact that the labor movement was not powerful enough to prevent a war. The Workers' and Peasants' Party and the Socialist Mass Party, the National Workers' and Peasants' Mass Party was created. However, it was too late. 2 months after the organization of this party, the turbulent events in Manchuria caused the inevitable retreat of the workers' and peasants' movement. At that time, in Japan there were 300,000 organized workers, which amounted to 7% of the total number of workers. These organized workers were drawn into the whirlpool of the struggle between left, centrist and right-wing political forces, which divided the working class movement and undermined the unity of the working class. All this, naturally, led to the fact that the labor movement was not powerful enough to prevent a war. The Workers' and Peasants' Party and the Socialist Mass Party, the National Workers' and Peasants' Mass Party was created. However, it was too late. 2 months after the organization of this party, the turbulent events in Manchuria caused the inevitable retreat of the workers' and peasants' movement. At that time, in Japan there were 300,000 organized workers, which amounted to 7% of the total number of workers. These organized workers were drawn into the whirlpool of the struggle between left, centrist and right-wing political forces, which divided the working class movement and undermined the unity of the working class. All this, naturally, led to the fact that the labor movement was not powerful enough to prevent a war. 2 months after the organization of this party, the turbulent events in Manchuria caused the inevitable retreat of the workers' and peasants' movement. At that time, in Japan there were 300,000 organized workers, which amounted to 7% of the total number of workers. These organized workers were drawn into the whirlpool of the struggle between left, centrist and right-wing political forces, which divided the working class movement and undermined the unity of the working class. All this, naturally, led to the fact that the labor movement was not powerful enough to prevent a war. 2 months after the organization of this party, the turbulent events in Manchuria caused the inevitable retreat of the workers' and peasants' movement. At that time, in Japan there were 300,000 organized workers, which amounted to 7% of the total number of workers. These organized workers were drawn into the whirlpool of the struggle between left, centrist and right-wing political forces, which divided the working class movement and undermined the unity of the working class. All this, naturally, led to the fact that the labor movement was not powerful enough to prevent a war. These organized workers were drawn into the whirlpool of the struggle between left, centrist and right-wing political forces, which divided the working class movement and undermined the unity of the working class. All this, naturally, led to the fact that the labor movement was not powerful enough to prevent a war. These organized workers were drawn into the whirlpool of the struggle between left, centrist and right-wing political forces, which divided the working class movement and undermined the unity of the working class. All this, naturally, led to the fact that the labor movement was not powerful enough to prevent a war. 161.